Our last speaker is Gerald Horne. He will be giving the keynote address. Gerald Horne is a man of many accomplishments. Currently, he is the John J. Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Over the years, his research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. A prolific author, he has written more than 30 books and 100 articles detailing those issues and the work of many of the individuals and groups who have contributed towards the achievement of equality and justice. And we do have some of his books for sale in the other room back there. So give it up for Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I didn't realize I was going to be speaking in a holy space, because I'm going to be speaking about a very vile subject, which is the 45th President of the United States of America, and I feel like I'm desecrating this holy space by bringing up such an ugly subject. In fact, I've already decided to ditch some of the naughty jokes I was going to tell about this man, given the space that we're in. Sorry? But first of all, let me thank those who invited me, particularly Clarice Durham and the Birthday Boys, Ted Pearson and Frank Chaffman, and let me also congratulate the awardees, Reverend Helen Sinclair and Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa, who I'm sure you'll be hearing much more about in coming years, given his presentation this evening. And let me also say it's always a pleasure to come back to Chicago, because as the introductory remarks suggested, I do a lot of writing and research about radicalism and labor history, and you cannot talk about radicalism and labor history and African American history without talking about Chicago. And on the other hand, to those whom much is given, much is expected, and that is to say that if this nation and ultimately the planet is to pull itself out of this deep crisis in which we now find ourselves, Chicago is going to have to play a major role. So in preparing my remarks for this evening, I felt a certain liberation, since I know that I didn't have to oversimplify to a Chicago audience. I did not have to engage in any kind of misdirection for a Chicago audience. And I'm also choosing to be frank and candid, because with all this talk about a rising fascism in this nation, it seems to me it's better to be frank and candid and to have this discussion now rather than at the internment camps in Wrigley Field on the north side or Guaranteed Rate Field on the south side. I think we should be candid now rather than there. And this brings me to the theme for this evening, which was anticipated by William Shakespeare over 400 years ago, when in Timon of Athens he asked plaintively, what means that trump? Now, of course, Shakespeare may not have had in mind the definition of trumpery, that is to say, showy but worthless. Assuredly, the election of the 45th U.S. president has presented a profound crisis for this nation and indeed the world. On the global scale, he's threatened North Korea with fire and fury. I'll interject my naughty joke now, and you can stone me if it's too naughty. Actually, it's from Conan O'Brien, who, after Mr. Trump said that he was going to rain down fire and fury on North Korea, Conan O'Brien said he spoke to Melania Trump. And she said, don't pay attention. He promises that every night and nothing happens. Most recently, he's pledged to destroy North Korea And of course, according to Jimmy Fallon of The Tonight Show, that must mean he plans to become president of North Korea because he's destroying the United States as president of the United States. He's threatened a trade war with China. He's caused Moscow to accuse Washington of, quote, state-sponsored hooliganism, unquote, after the U.S. authorities in early September entered Russia diplomatic compounds in this nation for unauthorized searches. He's threatened military intervention in Venezuela, sought to roll back his predecessor's entente with Cuba, threatened to junk a finely wrought nuclear deal with Iran, which could not only entice Iran to develop nuclear weapons, now forestalled, but could also cause this country to be more isolated than it already is internationally. This erratic regime has threatened to upend relations with nations as diverse as Mexico, Germany, and South Korea. In withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, he's displayed a cavalier attitude towards climate change. And of course, as a person who barely escaped from Houston, I'm very sensitive about that issue, given Hurricane Harvey. At home, Trump began his campaign in June 2015 in Manhattan, demonizing those of Mexican origin. He's questioned the impartiality of a judge simply because he was of Mexican origin. He's compounded that attack by seeking to trick the dreamers, those predominantly of Mexican origin of this nation through no fault of their own, now threatened with deportation. He's confessed to being a sexual predator on the now notorious Access Hollywood tape. He sought to purge transgender troops from the military, just as he issues one bellicose threat after another, targeting various nations. He's offered a tax cut plan that enhances the welfare of the 1%, while leaving unaddressed the real needs of many of the 63 million who voted for him. He sought to overturn overtime rules promulgated by his predecessor, and if successful, this would mean a wage cut for millions of workers. He's given aid and comfort to neo-Nazis and Klansmen in the aftermath of that notorious August 2017 outrage in Charlottesville, Virginia, with his attempt to draw moral equivalence between those supporting and protesting neo-fascism. And he's placed in the doghouse those who objected to his offensive words, including economic advisor Gary Cohn and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. Trump's Justice Department, under the misleadership of one Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, has sought to wound affirmative action in impugning the bona fides of African American and Mexican American youth in particular in leading colleges and universities. He sought to lift the ban on turning over warfighting tools to local police departments, which could only mean more carnage in our streets and the deaths of more Michael Browns and Laquan McDonalds. He sought to overturn the Affordable Care Act, thus jeopardizing the lives and well-beings of countless millions, and again, including many who voted for him. He's relied relentlessly in such a manner that mendacity is now being normalized, with disastrous implications of what remains of the moral fiber of this nation. So obviously, all of us have to ask, how did we come to the brink of this disaster? And just as important, what can be done to drag us away from the precipice? And that'll be the substance of my remaining remarks in the next few minutes. Now, unfortunately, many of the analyses that seek to respond to these inquiries are incomplete, if not misleading. What I mean is that some have provided what they deem to be a working class analysis that focuses on how certain workers, defined as white, voted in 2016 in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in particular. Interestingly, if you were to do a Google search, you probably would find that use of the term working class, interestingly enough, skyrocketed during 2016, since previously the vague term middle class has been the preferred term in this country for wage earners, not least by some of these now born-again class warriors who are putting forward what they consider to be a working class analysis. This suggests that reviving the term working class in certain circles so suddenly was an indicator of how this kind of analysis has not been sharp and incisive to the extent that it would have weaknesses in explicating this 2016 electoral debacle. Similarly, there has been insufficient focus on what Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton discusses in her recent memoir, What Happened. That is to say, how and why 52% of women defined as white voted for a confessed sexual predator. Of course, segmenting the working class in a racial manner is flawed from the inception, not to mention that it does little to explain why workers not defined as white, such as workers of African descent, tended to vote against Trumpery by a margin of 9-1. Such racial segmenting feeds this misguided narrative that we should pay more attention to the suffering and misery of Euro-American workers, since presumably other workers are doing just fine and dandy, thank you very much. Likewise, much has been made about the alleged Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, setting aside the cogent point that given Washington's frequent interference in foreign elections globally, it was inevitable that chickens would come home to roost. Setting that aside for a moment, is worthy of consideration to note that the supposed hundreds of thousands of dollars Moscow purportedly spent on Facebook ads and on other means somehow did not influence black women who voted against Trumpery by a rate of 95-5. I presume that they look at the internet and surf Facebook, etc. Those who maintained that the hand of Moscow tipped the presidential scales in 2016 are duty-bound to provide an explanation of this race-cum-gender differential. However, don't hold your breath for such an explanation, I'm afraid. Moreover, even though some of our friends have disdained a class analysis until recently for fear that it might open them to unfounded charges of being closet Marxists, some have sought vainly to explain this 2000 presidential election on class grounds while ignoring the unavoidable factor of race, in that, as ever, the GOP lost the majority of votes amongst people of color, broadly defined. Still, we would be remiss if we chose to believe that the election of this fiasco in the Oval Office was a bolt from the blue, an anomaly, an aberration. Indeed, it seems that after every national disaster in this country, the shooting of children in Newtown, Connecticut, or even a presidential election, we are told, quote, "That's not who we are." This mantra is repeated so consistently and relentlessly that one would think that USA actually stood for the United States of anomalies, or the United States of aberrations, or as the late writer Gore Vidal once put it, the United States of amnesia. This pattern actually defies pattern recognition, which is the basis for doing an analysis, which suggests that such an approach basically forbids analysis, as if every disaster is virtually inexplicable and thus defies not only anticipation but prescription and remedy. It's almost like the music of Duke Ellington, where the United States itself is rendered beyond category, or like the work of certain poets and painters, which are considered to defy interpretation. Such a thoughtless analysis would replicate yet another fundamental flaw in the current discourse on what ails the United States, that is to say, contrasting the alleged superiority of a mythical past in contrast with today's troubled future. What I mean is, what is taught in our schools is that there was the supposed Grand Revolution in 1776, constituting a great leap forward for humanity, which of course flies in the face of the fact that the indigenous people were expropriated and subjected to genocide, which worsened tremendously after the founding of the slaveholders' republic, not to mention Africans, not just on these shores where the African slave trade increased spectacularly after 1776, but also in Cuba, where U.S. slave traders had ousted the Spanish from control of the slave trade as early as the 1790s, or Brazil, where U.S. slave traders are largely responsible for the fact that this nation now contains the largest population of African descent this side of Nigeria. This was the immediate fruit of this so-called Grand Revolution. This approach, which salutes the alleged superiority of a mythical past, only serves to replicate the myopia of the current fraudulent slogan, "Make America Great Again." Go back to genocide and mass enslavement. In other words, some of the alleged stalwart opponents of Trumpery are actually putting wind in his sails. This is no minor matter, since remarkably more and more within the mainstream, not to mention the left, are mulling the possibility that the United States may be on the brink of a unique kind of neo-fascism. And let me point you to the events of the last few hours in particular, where Mr. Trump has picked a fight with millionaire black athletes, Stephen Curry and Colin Kaepernick in particular, in order to inflame his base on a race class axis. Recall that when the founding father of modern Bulgaria, Georgy Dimitrov, began writing in the 1930s about fascism, or the naked terroristic dictatorship of the most backward elements of the ruling class, it seemed that this phenomenon was correlated directly to the rising challenge from the left, particularly unions and left-wing political parties, with fascism seen as a rebuke to this challenge. Now, how is it that the United States is said to be on the brink of fascism, though with respect, the United States does not seem to have the potent left-wing political parties and allied unions that were present in Italy in the 1920s or in Germany in the 1930s, not to mention Chile in the 1970s? Why is it that a disturbing list of right-wing commentators, including former Nixon aide Pat Buchanan and current Trump advisor Roger Stone and wildly popular right-wing talk show host Michael Savage, all have warned of, quote, civil war, unquote, if the 45th US president is removed from office even by legal means? Let me remind you that the last civil war on this soil involved the slaughter of over 700,000, a bloodbath of spectacular proportion. Now, fortunately, some of even our liberal historians are providing us with insight that may help to resolve this matter of why the United States is said to be on the brink of fascism, despite not having the kind of radical left-wing movements that many had thought was a conditioned precedent to the rise of fascism. The first point to acknowledge is that it should come as a surprise only to those who have not been paying attention that a nation that endured mass enslavement, genocide of the indigenous, and Jim Crow could be capable of unleashing fascism. In any case, many of these historians don't go as far as I go in the book that's out on the table, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. However, they are marching right up to the brink. I'll point you to the prize-winning book by Robert Parkinson, The Common Cause, or the recent book by the most decorated U.S. historian not writing, Alan Taylor, in his book American Revolutions, both of which move decisively away from the creation myth about the founding of the slaveholders' republic. I would add to this growing list the recent book by Michael Klarman of Harvard Law School, The Framers' Coup, which revises downward the heroic understanding of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights in particular. I would be hesitant to get medical treatment from a physician who has not kept pace with the literature, or with a lawyer not current on recent court opinions and legislation. But unfortunately, I'm afraid that many of our political leaders have not kept up with the evolving understanding of the political landscape they're seeking to influence, suggesting that their political estimates, their strategies and tactics may be askew, which is one more reason why we may unfortunately stumble into neo-fascism. However, even if one has not kept pace with the reinterpretation and reimagining of the tawdry history of this nation, There is sufficient evidence in recent events to make one think long and hard about the prospect of a surge in fascism. After all, as we mull over this distinct possibility, we should not forget that in 1991, a card-carrying Klansman and Nazi, David Duke, received 55% of the Euro-American vote in a failed attempt to become governor of Louisiana. Perhaps because it is deemed to be an inconvenient truth, few analysts seem to acknowledge or even care that in the heart of Dixie, since 1964, GOP standard bearers routinely receive 80 to 90% of the Euro-American vote in a staggering example of cross-class collaboration. We should not be surprised that a reality TV star gets elected president when a declining action movie hero got elected governor of California, or a washed-up professional wrestler got elected governor of Minnesota, or that a backward music performer, Kid Rock, is being seriously touted to become a U.S. senator from Michigan. And fortunately, instead of engaging in pattern recognition and attempting to divine what this disturbing pattern tells us, too many treat each episode as wholly unique, which may be comforting, but ultimately delays the moment of reckoning, which now may have arrived with the election of the 45th US president. History, however, may provide a clue as to this dilemma in which we are now facing, particularly this conundrum of how we could be talking about a rising fascism when the historical pattern has been rising fascism usually arises to confront a rising left-wing movement, which, with all due respect, and I consider myself part of the left wing, I can't say that I'm on the verge of becoming governor of Texas. Now, if you look at the history of this country, for example, you may have noticed that there was a black scare in the 18th century. That is to say, the terrifying possibility that had congealed in the minds of many settlers that the Africans, in league with the indigenous, and perhaps with an assist from a foreign power, first Spain before 1776 and Britain thereafter, would rise up, which in fact did occur in August 1814, when Africans in red coats sacked Washington, D.C., sending the slave-owning president James Madison fleeing into the streets, one step ahead of the posse along with his garrulous spouse Dolly. This was occurring as the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, had ignited a general crisis of the entire slave system in the Americas, which could only be resolved with this collapse, which it proceeded to do circa 1863 to 1865. In sum, in an episode which you are more familiar than most, though Chicago and Barack Obama ruled as largely a centrist, it may not be coincidental that the man who embodied the so-called birther campaign, putting forward the absurd claim that the 44th president was illegitimate, not least since he was supposedly born in Kenya, representing the latest version of the Black Scare, it's not surprising that the leader of the birther campaign emerges as his successor. In any case, it is not useful to speak of emerging U.S. neo-fascism without placing this phenomenon in a historical context that pays attention to the historical peculiarities of this republic. Now, of course, we do recall that many of our friends and comrades thought that during the height of McCarthyism, fascism was imminent, particularly when a seeming man on a white horse, General Eisenhower, was elected president in 1952. Instead, a mass movement assisted by strong global currents caused the retreat of Jim Crow and the illiberalism that propelled it. So that should make us cautious about making large claims about the rise of neo-fascism. Similarly, as we seek to gauge the imminence of fascism, we should take note of the defeat of the neo-fascist National Front in France, the decline of the ultra-right-wing UK Independence Party, which pushed Brexit through in June 2016 in Britain. Tomorrow's results in Germany should be studied very carefully, particularly the totals rung up by the so-called Alternative for Germany party, which is blatantly and boldly neo-fascist. That'll give us some idea about what might happen on this side of the Atlantic. On the other hand, there was the defeat of the ultra-right in elections in Holland and Austria. Despite setbacks, the alliance in South Africa remains in the saddle, as do their comrades in the former frontline states. Of course, on the other hand, there has been a retrenchment of the progressive forces in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, where I'm afraid there is a surging neo-fascist movement that in many ways is stronger than the neo-fascist movement in this country. In other words, to assess the prospects for neo-fascism in the United States, we must pay close and careful attention to like-minded movements globally, not least in this hemisphere. Now, let me be clear. In order to struggle together against Trumpery today, we do not have to agree on the fruits of 1776 yesterday, just as we do not have to have agreement about the future of this country, as long as we agree on the present, which is a relentless struggle against Trumpery and Trumpism. Still, my own opinion is that one cannot make an adequate political estimate of the forces on the battlefield, which political generals and privates alike must do, unless one has an adequate understanding of settler colonialism and its roots in white supremacy. Let me also say, I'm going to skip ahead a few points, that if you really want to understand how we got to this crisis, you do have to understand Moscow, but not in the way that's now being touted in the press. That is to say, in the previous epoch, the Cold War, the United States not only found it necessary to spend trillions on the Pentagon rather than on education and healthcare, but more than that, it was felt that left-led unions like the National Maritime Union and the International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union based on the West Coast had to be weakened. And when these left-leaning unions were weakened, this made a sector of the working class not only poorer, but ideologically vulnerable to the blandishments of a con man like Donald J. Trump. Likewise, part of the Cold War bargain was to cut a deal with the People's Republic of China on an anti-Moscow basis, which then led to runaway shops to Asia, but did not contemplate the creation of this juggernaut in Beijing, which with every passing day is constraining opportunities for the United States of America. So this brings me to my final point, that is to say, what we need to do. First of all, Chicago, which is replete with migrants from Dixie, should take a special responsibility in the field of Southern solidarity. Perhaps unions and related groups should exact a special tax to sponsor organizing in the South, as was done with Operation Dixie after World War II. As the 2016 election suggests, the massive anti-Trump vote in this state can be negated by the fact that Dixie continues to remain an outpost of reaction, yet it has an Achilles heel in the form of a sizable black population which tends to lean against the right. Let me say parenthetically that in terms of trying to explain fiascos and debacles, I'm all ears as to how Chicagoans can explain how you elected Bruce Rauner and how he has been able so far to get away with vetoing a minimum wage bill that would have raised the hourly rate to $15 an hour by 2022. How did he get away with that? Second, speaking of unions, Canada, in the midst of the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement renegotiation demanded by the White House, is now demanding that states in the United States junk their so-called right-to-work laws or right-to-work-for-less laws, or anti-union laws, which would be a step forward for progress in this nation. That is to say, obviously, we should be joining with our Canadian friends and gaining momentum from their effort in terms of getting rid of these anti-union laws. Third, we should not shirk the impeachment remedy as we gear up for the 2018 elections. In the current issue of the New York Review of Books, Noah Feldman of Harvard Law School co-authors a case for the prosecution based on Mr. Trump's violation of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, most recently when a large delegation from Malaysia, the Southeast Asian nation, stayed at the Trump Hotel in Washington and paid premium prices with that money going directly into his pocket. Another charge, of course, would be obstruction of justice and the firing of FBI Director James Comey, defamation of Barack Obama and charging him falsely with wiretapping. The list is long. We should not be intimidated by the fact that his backers threaten civil war if we are successful. Finally, this demand of Canada and my previous analysis suggests that the global prospects for fascism, helping to determine the domestic prospects, should remind us of the importance of global currents in propelling us forward in this nation. This was true during the bad old days of slavery, when the Haitian Revolution and the strength of British abolitionists played a central role in abolishing slavery, or how the rise of decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean had impact on Jim Crow in this country. We should build upon victories. For example, our pressure caused the sacking of Sebastian Gorka, the White House aide with murky ties to Hungarian fascists, and Steve Bannon, the so-called strategist with not so murky ties to what is euphemistically called the alt-right. Pressure should now be placed on key Trump aide Stephen Miller, the anti-immigrant Tribune, and his aide Julie Hahn. Interestingly, like Bannon, both have roots in Southern California, which with its Latino plurality is seen as particularly hostile to white supremacy, the GOP, and immigrant bashing. And of course, absolutely finally, speaking of Los Angeles, it would do well to study the example of the Chicago Alliance and its push for a civilian police accountability council, which when implemented will serve as a major deterrent against the lawless slayings of our youth, which of course is a precondition to the rise of fascism, when our youth can be mowed down in the streets without due process of law like they're dogs. Thus, despite the apparent odds, I'm confident that we can amass the domestic and yes, global forces to bring Trumpery to its knees. And as this process unfolds, I am confident even more that the Chicago Alliance and Chicago generally will be in the forefront. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Horne.